What if Ukraine hadn't given up their nuclear weapons after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Would that have prevented the Russian invasion in 2022? Why did Ukraine even give up its nuclear weapons? Because let's face it, no one has tried to liberate nations that have nukes. The truth is, Ukraine most likely could not have held on to their nuclear arsenal, as you will see. And even if they had kept their nukes, they would not have been able to leverage them. But the reason is not what you think. The common public perception used to be that the Ukrainian government would have quickly collapsed if the Russian military invaded Ukraine. Then, Russia did in fact invade Ukraine on February 24, 2022, simultaneously from multiple locations, north, south, and east. Russia even sent dozens of troop-carrying helicopters directly to Kiev in a tactic that video gamers will recognize as a heli rush. A rush can quickly end the game against an unprepared opponent or a noob, but in most cases fails and costs the aggressor the complete loss of those units. Probably the plan was to quickly scare Zelensky's government into capitulation and avoid a costly war. But if anything, the past few weeks have proven that you cannot scare comedians, even with aggression. Unfortunately, tens of thousands of soldiers have died since the invasion began. Millions of refugees have fled the country, and today both sides are preparing for the fight over Donbass, where Ukraine is estimated to have between 30 to 50% of its combat forces, which Russia is attempting to encircle and cut off. This might be the bloodiest active combat since World War II in Europe. But how did it come to this, and what could have prevented this conflict? Had Ukraine been a member of NATO, it would have been protected by Article 5 and unlikely to have been invaded. The main reason both NATO and Russia avoid direct confrontation with each other is because both sides carry the world's largest arsenals of nuclear weapons, the use of which would result in nuclear Armageddon. Ironically, preventing Ukraine from joining NATO is the main reason cited by Russia for this invasion. But what if Ukraine had its own nuclear weapons? Well, they used to. When the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991, Ukraine ended up with one of the most powerful armies on the planet by the stroke of a pen. This meant Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Just to give you some perspective, there were 176 intercontinental ballistic missile launchers with some 1,240 warheads on Ukrainian territory, as well as several dozen strategic nuclear bombers. In addition, as many as 3,000 tactical nuclear weapons rounded out an arsenal totaling approximately 5,000 strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. But what happened to all those nuclear weapons? Let us start by telling you what could have happened to them, and you might be a bit happier about what actually happened. Ukraine inherited huge stockpiles of conventional weapons. The Soviet Union placed about 30% of its military industry there, employing 40% of the Ukraine's working population, thus making it one of the most prosperous regions of the USSR. The military-industrial complex in a socialist country means windfall of profits for the people. 50 to 60% of all Ukrainian enterprises were tied to supporting the Soviet war machine. Ukraine was also a leader in missile-related technology and put this advantage to use in the arms export market in the 1990s. And this is where things start to get shady. The arms export market is very profitable, which is why it's also highly competitive. Losing its main customer, the Soviet war machine, and now in competition with Russia and the rest of the world for arms business, Ukraine was forced to look into exporting arms to politically unstable and even aggressive regimes. Ukraine established its own networks for arm export and at first did so outside of international rules and bans, also known as the black market. In 1992, Ukraine signed its first contracts on weapons deliveries to Iran, which was not well received by the West. The United States took note of this and actively worked to bring the Ukrainian military arms situation under control. On May 13, 1994, the United States and Ukraine signed a memorandum of understanding on the transfer of missile equipment and technology. This agreement committed Ukraine to adhere to the Missile Technology Control Regime by controlling exports of missile-related equipment and technologies according to the MTCR guidelines. Despite these efforts, the majority of Ukraine's huge weapons stockpiles still slip through the metaphorical cracks of endemic corruption, a vestige of the Soviet era, and the weapons continued to flow into the black market. According to the WikiLeaks cables, United States diplomats described Ukraine of the 1990s and the 2000s as a corrupt kleptocracy. On the 2012 Corruption Perceptions Index, Ukraine ranks the same as Syria and the Republic of the Congo. Even a Ukrainian parliamentary inquiry concluded that between 1992 and 1998, Ukraine lost $32 billion in military assets, in part through theft, discount arms sales, and lack of oversight, while they only spent $500 million on legal arms for defense in 1999. Currently, Ukraine is Europe's #1 country in arms trafficking, and this is why some critics warn that the weapons that are currently being shipped to Ukraine to help them with defense against Russia could end up in the wrong hands and on the black market. Given all this, I think you'd agree that the prospect of Ukraine once having had nuclear weapons sounds troubling. So what happened to Ukraine's massive stockpile of nuclear weapons? They were all handed over to Russia. One of the reasons for shipping those nukes to Russia was the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine adopted in July of 1990. The declaration proclaimed that the Republic had the intent to become a permanently neutral state that does not participate in military blocs, and that it would not accept, produce, nor procure nuclear weapons. This can be seen as a political compromise made in the dying days of the Soviet Union and the infancy of the Ukrainian state. But the bilateral negotiations between Russia and Ukraine were not going anywhere, so the United States got involved in what became the trilateral process. Not wanting to compromise its relationship with the West, and in conformity with its previous agreements, by May of 1992, Ukraine voluntarily removed all tactical nuclear weapons, approximately 3,000 of them, inherited from the former Soviet Union. On January 14, 1994, the presidents of the three countries met and signed a trilateral statement and its annex. Those documents provided that Ukraine would transfer all strategic warheads on its territory to Russia for elimination, and in return would receive security assurances, compensation for the commercial value of the highly enriched uranium, and non-Luger assistance to help with the disposal of ICBMs, ICBM silos, bombers, and other infrastructure on Ukrainian territory. The trilateral process continued with Ukraine's accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapons state in fall of 1994. A few months later, in December of 1994, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and now additionally the United Kingdom signed a memorandum to provide Ukraine with security assurances in connection with its accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The assurances included the promise to have all sides respect the independence, sovereignty, and the existing borders of Ukraine, to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and to refrain from economic coercion to secure advantages of any kind. Ultimately, the trilateral process and the Budapest Memorandum were seen as a significant success by all sides in disarming Ukraine of nuclear weapons. By June of 1996, all nuclear warheads had been removed from Ukraine. But was this a wrong path to take for Ukraine? Would have Russia still dared to invade Ukraine in 2022 or annex Crimea in 2014 if Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons? To use nuclear weapons as a deterrent, they have to be operational. And that doesn't just mean having physical control of the weapons. You must be able to arm and launch them. Otherwise, it's like having sports cars in your garage that you don't have the keys to. It's only good for Instagram. A Permissive Action Link, or PAL, is an access control security device buried deep within a nuclear weapon. Its purpose is to prevent unauthorized arming or detonation of the nuclear weapon. To arm a nuclear weapon, you need the codes to disarm the PAL. No code, no deterrence. And who had the code to Ukrainian nuclear weapons? You guessed it, Mother Russia. But this was one of the reasons for Ukraine giving up their nuclear arsenal. There were also other reasons that made it a more compelling case. For example, the ICBMs had a minimum range of 3,100 miles due to the nature of how ballistic missiles work. And since Ukraine is right next door to Russia's main populated areas, Ukraine's ICBMs could have only been retargeted to hit Russia's Far East, also known as Siberia. But they could still present a threat to the US, which is within the 6,200-mile estimated maximum range. Had Ukraine decided to establish full operational control of the nuclear weapons, it would have faced sanctions by the West and perhaps even a withdrawal of diplomatic recognition by the United States and other NATO allies. They would have also likely faced retaliatory action by Russia. Given that they didn't have a nuclear weapons program, Ukraine would have also struggled with replacing the nukes once their service life expired. And finally, in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons, Ukraine received financial compensation as well as the security assurances of the Budapest Memorandum. Of course, the value of those assurances is questioned today. Western countries, for their part, have indeed provided record amounts of weapons and arms supplies, military training and assistance in the years leading up that have greatly benefited Ukraine in increasing its security force. Without this assistance, it's unlikely that the Ukrainian forces could have performed as they have done so far against Russia's 2022 invasion. Ukrainian academics argue that the missed opportunity was not Ukraine's surrender of nuclear weapons, but rather the utter neglect of their conventional armed forces. Had Ukrainian leaders worked as servants of the people rather than enriching themselves, the country could have had a well-equipped and well-organized modern army. They could have also focused on obtaining Western help the way they have since the 2014 Maidan, much sooner. The difference that the help from NATO allies has provided can be seen in Ukraine's effective military response to Russia in 2022 versus 2014 when it lost Crimea and some portions of Donbass without much of a fight. The real long-term deterrence against Russia is not enriched uranium in a warhead, but an enriched democracy in the nation.